Hello and good morning. My name is Sydney Bell, the Network Program Lead for the Ontario Network of CAPC and CPNP projects. I'm really delighted to be here and welcoming you to the first session of day 2 of our 2024 online conference. And with us this morning is Jocelyne Lalonde, who is going to be speaking to us about trauma-informed care. And I'll just quickly share with you some information about Jocelyne. Jocelyne is a proud Franco-Manitobian and a certified motivational interviewer with a master's degree in family social science and an honors bachelor's degree in sociology. Jocelyne has over 15 years of experience working with youth, families, and adults in community, government, and school settings. Jocelyne's expertise and passion center around addiction, other mental health concerns, and wellness. Most recently, she has enjoyed teaching at the post-secondary level, where her research is focused on the experience of youth in and from the child welfare system. Welcome, Jocelyne.
Thank you, Sydney. Thank you so much for having me. Good morning, everybody. We've got an hour together. As my intro said, I'm a Franco-Manitobaine, so I tend to talk quickly, but I heard the feedback that perhaps slow down. So I'm going to do my best to hopefully give you guys some good nuggets in the hour that we have together. So hopefully, for some people, this will be new information. For others, it'll be, validating what you already know. And for others, you can catch up on your crocheting while I'm talking. So welcome. I'm zooming in from Winnipeg. So I work and live on Treaty 1 territory, which is the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, as well as the heartland of the Métis Nation. Here in Winnipeg, we enjoy clean drinking water from Shoal Lake First Nation, which is in Ontario. And of course, Shoal Lake First Nation only had access to clean drinking water just in September 2021. Which is pretty awful. I say that because land acknowledgement sometimes can feel like lip service, and my commitment to reconciliation is to learn more about our colonial history and to share that with the next generation. So I've got 3 kiddos, 2 6-year-olds, and one who just turned 9 this morning. Today it's her birthday. And we have dinner table conversations about what's going on. We follow the news, all appropriate, of course. I'm not sharing with them, but we talk about what it means to live in Canada and what our history means and what it is and what our commitment needs to be as a family to move towards reconciliation. So welcome, everybody. We're going to be talking about trauma-informed care. And this is a full-day workshop that I often give. I talk about trauma-informed care in different settings, including schools. So I'm going to give you guys the highlights and the Coles notes to just get a sense of what it's all about and hopefully give you some concrete stuff to take away and start implementing right away. I'm going to be asking us to do an assessment later in just maybe about 5 minutes or less. So if people have access to a piece of paper and a pen, that would be awesome if you want to participate in the assessment that I'm going to be offering here shortly. So of course we know that here in Canada, and the stats are the same in the US, that trauma is something that affects lots of people. So we believe it's about 60% of the population has experienced at least one ACE. So for those of you who aren't familiar, ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. So just essentially some trauma in our history, in our childhood. So it's quite pervasive. I like to think about it in terms of, doing things differently. If we're considering that people may and likely have a trauma history, why not act differently to act in a way with a spirit of compassion to ensure everybody gets the best care possible. I'm thinking about, like, in the school system, for example, we don't bring peanut butter sandwiches to school anymore, right? And we know that a peanut allergy affects far less than 67% of the population, but we do that because that's appropriate. We don't bring peanuts in the classroom anymore. When I was going to school, that wasn't the case. This is a change that we were able to make as a community, as a society, and we just do things different to accommodate certain parts of our population. So I kind of like to take that idea around trauma, and that because it is so pervasive, why don't we just act a little differently and embrace the spirit of trauma-informed care that we'll talk about right away. And so because we are talking about trauma, sometimes things can come up So I just want people to consider what you might do if you are feeling a little overwhelmed. So as we're talking today, something might come up for you. So maybe shooting a friend a text, or leaning on some of your own regulation strategies in terms of deep breathing and that kind of thing. And of course, feel free to, we're in a Zoom environment, so you can get up and walk around and stretch your legs, or go pet your cat, talk to somebody else in your household or your office or whatever. So just know that something can come up, and be prepared for that. So when we're talking about trauma, so as I mentioned, it's quite pervasive. And I mentioned the number 67% of folks here in Canada have likely experienced some adversity in their background in terms of trauma. But if we think about the helping community, so I know we have a vast array of professionals in the room today, which is so awesome. But we know that helpers as a particular group tend to have more trauma than the average person. So us here as a community, good chance that we have a little bit more of that stuff in our history than others. And there's lots of reasons for that. When I talk about why we sometimes have more trauma in our history as helpers, I think, it's probably has something to do with the reason that we got into the work. So I'm just going to encourage people to think for a moment about why you are in the role that you are in some sort of capacity in terms of helping. So what got you into the work? Why are you still doing the work? Has the reason changed over the years? And I refer to that reason as sort of our anchor point. So if we are deeply rooted and connected to that reason is why we do the hard work of helping and supporting, that's actually a buffer against things like compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma and burnout. Remembering what is my anchor point? Why do I do the work I do? In my office, I've got a little sticky note up in the corner near my desk that reminds me of why I did the work. So why I do the work. So sometimes, people do the work because, hey, when I was growing up, or when I was a young person, or even into my adulthood, I didn't have anybody to support me, and I want to be that somebody for somebody else. Or maybe we had an influential person that did change the course of our life. Maybe it was an opportunity. Maybe it was somebody in our life that said, hey, you seem to really be a natural supporter or helper or connector. So just remembering that reason and recognizing that we're all on our healing journey to some extent. Some of us might be in the early stages of our healing journey, others might be further along. So the idea of trauma-informed care and coming to seeing the spirit of trauma-informed care tells us that when we're thinking about people who are affected by trauma, sometimes they are early on in that healing journey where trauma is really in the driver's seat. Right? So that history is making the decisions, it's dictating feelings, behaviors. It's just really taking over a person's life in a lot of ways, right? The trauma is absolutely in the driver's seat. And sometimes for those people, they're not even aware of it, right? And we're not going to unpack sort of how memory and trauma all go together, but we can all acknowledge that trauma, sometimes we're not aware of how trauma is dictating our behavior, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, etc. So it's really dictating for some people what the direction of their life. For some of us who may be a little bit further along in our healing journey, maybe it's in the passenger seat. Maybe trauma is still there. I can see it. It's ever present, but it's one step away that I can acknowledge, or I see how trauma has impacted me and how it's been a big part of my life. And I'm sort of, deciding to do things different and being intentional and thoughtful about how it's been affecting me. And then for others, we could continue with the metaphor that's kind of lame. Sometimes maybe the trauma's in the back seat. We were a little bit further along in our healing journey. For some of us, maybe that the trauma is even in the trunk. We know it's there. We're carrying it around. It's heavy at times, but we're able to put it down and take a break and have that space and that control to understand how it's impacted our lives. And of course, trauma doesn't just affect the person who is traumatized. It certainly has a ripple effect, right? So if we think, as an example, the impacts of our colonial history here in Canada, the intergenerational trauma, the systemic oppression and racism that's embedded in our institutions and our systems here in Canada, that has rippled out to impact whole communities, rip away culture, language. That's a big example. But even on a smaller scale, if we think about a kiddo in a school who's living maybe in an environment of domestic violence, and they go to school and they're sitting in a classroom and they're very dysregulated, they're having outbursts, that impacts the other kiddos in the classroom. It impacts the teacher, it impacts the administration, it goes on and on. So knowing that trauma is so pervasive, it just makes sense for us to consider that in terms of the support that we're providing our community and our colleagues, right? So as I'm talking about this, it's not just the people we serve I want us to keep in mind, but also our colleagues and our family and that person that we pass on the street. So what is trauma-informed care? There are lots of definitions out there. There's lots of research that speaks trauma-informed care and the benefits. So this is the definition that we're going to be working with. So trauma-informed care is an approach that understands the presence of trauma, acknowledges the role trauma can play in a person's life, and promotes environments that support the individual and collective well-being of everybody. So we don't need to become trauma specialists. We don't have to assume that everybody has a debilitating history of trauma. It's really just about being aware and acting on the possibility of the impacts that trauma might have on another. So at its core, it's really about encompassing a spirit of compassion, and we'll pick this apart as I move along. So we're going to talk about the 5 principles of trauma-informed care. Again, if you're familiar with these principles, there's lots of research out there that talks about them. These words might be a little bit different than what you've seen, but it's all kind of the same stuff. So we're going to talk about promoting awareness, shifting attitudes, providing choice, fostering safety, and also highlighting strengths, and how that plays into creating a culture of trauma-informed care. I would argue that if we are trying to move in the direction of providing more trauma-informed care, fostering safety is a good place to start. You know, we really need, if we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, we have to start at the bottom with our basic needs. And one of those basic needs, of course, is safety. So if you're in an office or an organization that you're like, yeah, this is something we want to start to bite off pieces of trauma-informed care. We're going to start to implement this in policies and procedures and you know, that kind of thing. A good place to start is around fostering safety as one of the principles. And then I would say promoting awareness and shifting attitudes are important as well. So we're going to unpack those. But first off, before we unpack them, I want us to get a sense of how trauma-informed our work environment is. So this is where I'm going to get you guys to pull out a pen and paper. So whenever we want to make changes, the first thing we got to do is we need to be aware, right? So I'm going to ask you guys to do this little assessment. So awareness is key. We need to start thinking about what is our work environment like? Are we operating in a trauma-informed way in little bits and pieces? Maybe there's some of the principles that we're implementing in some ways, maybe others we're doing a great job, but it helps give us an idea of where maybe we want to start with implementing some of the principles. So I'm going to give us a little minute, conscientious of the time. I'm going to ask us to move pretty quickly. So this is what it's going to look like. I want you to number your page from 1 to 15. And for each statement, I want you to indicate either a 5 that you strongly agree with the statement or a 1 that you strongly disagree with the statement. And what I'm going to encourage people to do, if it's not too much to ask, is maybe just snap a picture of my slide with your cell phone, and then that way I can give you guys both slides at the same time and you can operate off your screen.
Would it be
All right.
helpful for me to screen grab and
Sure.
then add let's see if I can see if I can do this. Screen grab this first one.
And then you're going to pop it in the chat.
That's the idea. Okay.
Great.
If I can be quick enough in my assessment 1. I'll save that in the downloads. Okay.
All right. And then here's my second slide.
Okay, so chat file.
So you all can go ahead and get started with that. I'm going to give you guys just 2 minutes to get started. And then here's the third screen, Sydney. So this is where you will be coming up with your totals for the different principles.
I could, if you go back, I could screen grab the second one.
Okay, great.
And then that'll be in the chat as well for people to grab.
The ratings are 5 strongly agree and 1 strongly disagree. 5 strongly agree, 1 strongly disagree. Did you get the second one, Sydney?
I did, and it's now in the chat. So both of
Okay,
the
awesome.
assessment slides are in the
I
chat.
got one more for you.
Okay, so I'll grab this one, the scoring one.
Great.
Okay.
And so this is an assessment that you can take, it's not exhaustive, but it's a starting point and it can get us thinking. And this is an assessment that you can take back to your work environment and do with your colleagues. It's a good place to start some discussion. So from the assessment, once we kind of get a sense of where we're at, then we can do all that other hard work if we decide. So developing a plan that's going to address some of the areas that have been highlighted as maybe, needing some work. And then we just keep an eye on it and see how it's going. But with any, big shift, it's best to just take off little chunks, right? So I'm going to be talking about all these principles and all the different ways we can be trauma informed. But best bet is just to take off a little chunk, a little bite and go, okay, this is where we're going to start. Organizing our work environment to be more trauma informed is not linear, right? We're going to go off in this direction. We're going to go off in that direction. We're going to circle back because when we're working with humans, nothing is nothing is simple, right? But the idea is just to get us thinking about it, get the juices flowing, and figure out where we can maybe start the work.
Sorry to
All right.
interrupt, Jocelyne. I
No
just need
problem.
to check. I see I posted the first two set of questions nested under a conversation. I didn't start them. Anyway, did anybody have any trouble finding those three documents? Okay.
Okay,
Okay,
awesome.
just double checking.
All right. So I'm going to keep moving just for the sake of time, but I'm hoping that this, again, assessment, whether it's helpful for you today or if it's something you can take back to your workplaces and it can be a starting point for you all. All right, so interpreting the survey. So principles with a score of 3 to 6 should be viewed as, hey, maybe we need a little bit of work here. If we see a score from 7 to 11, maybe we need to give it a little bit of attention. And principles with the score, but doing okay. And if we've got a score from 12 to 15, that's something to really be celebrated. So Sydney, I'm going to bug you for another screen grab. Thank you for doing that. I was going to take the extra
Absolutely.
step, but I'm sure people will appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so this is okay. I think I've got it.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. So just recognizing that we're coming from a lot of different backgrounds, I'm just going to quickly make a few brief notes about trauma. I see in the chat, 5 was 5 strongly disagree? Did I give you guys the opposite interpretation? Ay, ay, ay. We're off to a good start. So 5 indicates that you strongly agree with the statement, and 1 would indicate that you strongly disagree with the statement. So I'm just going to stick that in the chat here. There we go. All right. So quick, a few little notes on trauma before we dig into the principles. So this is a picture that a colleague of mine took in Guatemala. So he was on his way to work and this building was standing. So we can see on either side of the building that fell down, those buildings seem to be okay. They're strong, they're standing, but the building in the middle came down. So on his way to work, all the buildings were all 3 there. All was good. There was some tremors while he was at work. On his way back, that building didn't make it. It fell down. So the reason I'm showing this picture is because the idea that as he was walking past those buildings in the first place, you would not know that that middle building maybe had some infrastructure. There was something kind of weak about it, right? So maybe the walls weren't so great. I don't know anything about building a building, so this metaphor is falling apart real quick. But the beams weren't as strong or whatever, right? You wouldn't have known that from looking at the outside of the building, that the 2 buildings on the side were stronger and that the one in the middle was more susceptible to the ground tremors. And it's a good way to think about trauma, because really trauma is a wound, right? But it's an invisible wound. It's something that people are walking around with that we do not see, we cannot see. So if we imagine that, so trauma is not the traumatic event. It's not the near-death experience. It's not the car accident. It's not the abuse, neglect. Trauma Trauma is the wound that stays with us. And so if we think about, a cut on our hand, if you do nothing for that wound, there's a chance it's going to get infected, it's going to fester, it's going to get worse, there's going to be complications, right? And this is the same with trauma on the inside. It's a wound on the inside that we cannot see, and that if not given appropriate attention, it can really have lots of consequences for folks, right? And so we're just going to quickly touch on developmental trauma, recognizing that. So I've already talked about ACEs. That's my next slide here. And so these are adverse childhood experiences. The 10 that are talked about in terms of these adverse childhood experiences are abuse, so physical, emotional, sexual. There's also physical and emotional neglect, witnessing domestic violence, growing up in a household with substance abuse or mental illness, having a parent with living in a household with divorce or separation, and having a parent incarcerated. So these ACEs were derived from a study that was done in I believe it was the 90s. It was done by Kaiser Permanente, which is a health insurance company in the US. It was the largest sample of its size. 17,000 people participated. It was a longitudinal study that has just given us a wealth of information about the long-term impacts of trauma. So some of those long-term impacts are the things that are kind of obvious that we would imagine, right? Things like, addiction and mental health issues later in life. But some of the long-term impacts are more insidious. So things like, cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, having a lower income or lower educational attainment. So all this stuff is a result of those early childhood experiences. But of course, trauma isn't all just from early childhood, but we know that when there are traumas that occur in that stage of development, the impacts can be quite dramatic. So for example, there's even neurological impacts, right? So the way the brain develops and grows, if it is a traumatized brain, if it's a young person who's growing up in a toxic stress environment, there will be concrete changes to the brain. But not to say that we can't heal from that. So sadly, a lot of trauma comes from a relationship, right? But the good news is that we also heal from trauma through relationship. So we know that the impacts, of course, are quite dramatic. So we've got the physical, mental, behavioral, emotional, relational, spiritual. We know that trauma impacts all these different parts of our lives, and it's really far-reaching fingers. So the reason that I'm setting up and talking about trauma in this way and giving you guys this info is because I really believe that education is a bridge to empathy, right? The more we know, the more we can have that compassionate heart. So I'm just looking at the chat. And so somebody made a comment, would COVID-19 contribute to trauma? Of course. Oh my goodness, was that ever traumatic, right? And I think that point really reminds us that trauma is subjective and it's for the individual to define their trauma. So perhaps I've gone through something difficult, but I might have a different reaction or just different perception of that. I have a colleague who lost her dog. The dog was there for her through the death of her parents, a lot that she had gone on with. When the dog died, it was just completely soul crushing for her. But she faced a lot of judgment. People like, well, it's just your dog. But it's not for them to make the call, right? It's for her to say, no, this was something that was really hard for me. I do a lot of work in First Nations communities, and in terms of COVID, one of the impacts that I'm seeing really dramatically at First Nations communities, but I would argue in a lot of communities, and I'm curious what you guys have seen. But COVID-19 was so isolating, and now there's this, it seems like to get community back together again has been so hard. People are still continuing to reside in their silos and to be socially isolated, and we know that that is certainly traumatic. We need each other. Also, where we were at in our life during the pandemic, were we raising small children? Did we have the loss of a loved one? We couldn't be there when they were passing. These are all extra pieces on the pandemic that made it extra traumatizing for some of us. Lots of interesting conversation going on in the chat here. And so because of this trauma, we see in the people that we support, and I would argue, in our families and our communities, so personally and professionally, we see a lot of these challenging behaviors, right? And the idea behind trauma-informed care is to remind us to just find that compassion, understand that what we're seeing in front of us in terms of these challenging behaviors, it's probably not personal. And when we adopt sort of this sense of compassion, and so now I'm really talking about the principle of shifting our attitudes. So it's just a more peaceful existence for all of us. You know, if we're at the checkout buying groceries and the person doing our groceries is just giving us a mean mug and you're like, okay, what's going on with that person? What did I ever do to them? Or like, I don't know what happened in their day. I don't know what's going on for them. It depersonalizes it a bit and it can give us more patience when coming into some of these challenging behaviors. So some of you might be familiar with the work of Dr. Dan Siegel. He talks about the window of tolerance. So that's what we're looking at right here. I love this model. This is a model that I use with clients. I teach it. It's a really simple understanding of our trauma response or our survival responses. So I'm sure you guys are aware. We've got that in terms of survival responses. There's that fight or flight. So we'd call that a hyper aroused state. So that's where our nervous system, our central nervous system is preparing to take on the fight, or the hypo arousal where we see the freeze, the disassociation, the numbing, the shutting down. There's also that other F. So some of you might be familiar with the fawn response. A simple way to understand it is sort of that people pleasing response in the face of a threat. And remembering that we or our clients can be thrown into these survival responses in the face of real threat, but also perceived threat. And for folks with a long trauma history who've experienced trauma, even one-off traumas, we tend to get thrown into these trauma responses in ways that are really interrupting our life, right? So we've got a coworker who's coming into our office that's like, hey there, Jocelyne, you're late for the meeting. I'm going, who asked you to give me your opinion, right? So that I perceived threat where there wasn't any. And I had this big reaction that just wasn't proportional. So the idea here is the window of tolerance in between these little dotted lines. This is where we hope to live our existence. So that squiggly line is kind of like the passage of time. And then we've got the window of tolerance. So this is where we can take what life throws at us. And what I'm hoping for you guys and for the folks that we're supporting is that we have our own strategies and that we're teaching strategies to those we're supporting to widen that window, to have it nice and wide so that I'm not being thrown into my survival responses all the time. But for a lot of folks that we're supporting, we know that that window is super narrow, right? It doesn't take much. In my early 20s, I was working in a child welfare organization. I was a youth care worker. I was working in an independent living program. And really, I had no business doing that. I was barely older than the clients I was supporting, but that's another story. And so I had done some meal preparation, menu planning for the week with this young man. We go to the grocery store to buy his groceries so he can make these meals for the week. We've got a basket full of food. We get to the carrots. There are no carrots. So his name is Ian. Him and I are still in contact. We've known each other for over 20 years now. And Ian has said it is okay that I tell this story. So we get to the carrots and he loses his shit, if I may use some spicy language. Where are the carrots? Carrots are a staple. Like, what the hell's going on? How come there's no carrots? He's losing his mind. He dumps his groceries. He's freaking out. We were escorted out of the grocery store. So an example of how his window of tolerance was minuscule because of, arguably his history of trauma, which was quite complex. I'm happy to report that he is living a lovely life. He's a roofer and has got a family, and it's awesome. Yes. So we all, in our own existence, I'm sure you guys can think about times in your life where your window has been smaller versus wider. In my own life, this was a couple years ago now, about 4 years ago, we had mice in our house. I still have a couple mice in my house. I live in a very old home, but we had mice. I discovered these mice and I just lost it. I probably threw out half the contents of my basement. I was like steam cleaning everything. I just lost it. And everybody in my life kind of just stood back and looked at me like, whoa, what's up with that? And so, but now looking back, I was in the middle. I had lost my parents, both of them, in less, it was just over a year, and they had both passed. And there was some other stressful things going on. So I had this completely disproportional reaction to the mice. My window of tolerance was really small at that time in my life. So if we are recognizing for ourselves as helpers, how can I make that window bigger? Noticing when my window is narrowing, notice the signs in my own life that, hey, wait a minute, I'm getting to the edge of my window. I need to slow down. That is being on our healing journey. And by being able to recognize that for ourselves, we can teach that to the people we're supporting, and we're role modeling that behavior. So I teach in the psychiatric nursing department for Brandon University. I got into a fender bender a couple weeks ago on my way to class. So I was a few minutes late. I was just like, oh my gosh, how could I be so stupid? This fender bender, oh my gosh, all those things. I get into class, I'm totally discombobulated. So I say to my students, you know what? I'm discombobulated. I think I even used the language of the window of tolerance with them. It's like, my window is narrow. I'm like, I'm going to use a regulation strategy. So I'm saying this all out loud. I'm going to do some deep breathing. I'm going to cue it up on the screen. We're going to watch a YouTube video together. It's 5 minutes. It's for my own benefit because I need to regulate. But we can all do it together. So it's a way to show I am human. I get overwhelmed. It's okay. This is how I know I'm overwhelmed. I'm feeling these signs in my body, and therefore I'm going to do something about it. So concretely, even role modeling that to colleagues and to the people that we're supporting. And when we do that, we find ourselves in a more regulated state, and then we can do this beautiful thing of co-regulation, which is really a magical tool. So if we can get our own nervous system into a state of calm, that is absolutely contagious for the people around us. This is especially true when we're working with younger children, but it goes the whole gamut of the lifespan. So if I am regulated, my calm nervous system is going to help regulate your nervous system. But the reverse is also true. So if I'm losing my shit all the time and I'm dysregulated, I'm not paying attention to my own warning signs, my own triggers, I'm burning the candle at both ends, well, you can be sure as heck that I'm going to be impacting the people around me, and they are going to be also dysregulated in capacity. So this is great news and terrible news at the same time, because it means that we have to take responsibility for our own wellness, recognizing we can only do that to a point. We all operate in organizations and institutions, and we've got culture and all this stuff going around that we don't have control over, but we do have some control, which is paying attention to our own wellness and regulating and making sure that we're taking time to fill up our own cup, to belabor that metaphor, and intentionally filling up our cup. I love a hot shower after a stressful day. I imagine the water washing away the stresses and the trouble, and it has that lovely experience. I feel nice and warm. It's winter time. But if I had that shower and I wasn't intentional about it, if I was just showering and thinking about how I have to make supper and I have to drop the kids off and I have to go get the kids, these are all things that are in my mind now, I have to go pick up my kids' instruments so it's ready for the weekend for their concert, then I'm not really taking in the benefits of that self-care. So it's also about being very intentional, which is a trauma-informed idea. And it's also being very mindful. So when we're doing that good cup filling up stuff, you gotta be present. Otherwise, you're not getting the full benefits. So this brings us to our first principle of trauma awareness and promoting awareness. I've already, and you'll see that there's a lot of overlap between the principles, and everything I've been talking about so far is really interrelated to all these different principles, but we're going to talk about them as though they're completely separate for simplicity's sake. So the first principle is really about helping people around us understand the impacts of trauma and how that can impact behaviors and really speak to sort of those challenging behaviors that we see. So, thinking about your own work environment, we can do this educating through, in-person training, online training like we're doing today, which is awesome. Doing lunch and learns, reading. I've seen people use like little sign-offs in their email signatures about trauma just to help people have a better understanding. Maybe it's a newsletter where there's a dedicated little paragraph, those closed circuit TVs and waiting rooms, but just promoting awareness of a lot of us have trauma. It impacts us. It's pervasive. And having an attitude of compassion and empathy is just going to go a really long way. So that's kind of what we're trying to promote when we're thinking about this particular principle. Excuse me. Now, this comes with maybe a shadowy side that we need to address, which is that if we are talking about trauma and it is becoming more, if the people around us are becoming more aware of the impacts of trauma, it tends to put us in a vulnerable position. So we need to think about, okay, well, if we're talking about trauma and it might bring stuff up for people, what is there to support my colleagues, or what is my organization doing to support the staff if they are finding that, hey, yeah, okay, trauma. Now what? I'm aware of it. I'm not starting to see that it's actually been a part of my life. It's actually been sitting on my shoulder. I worked for an organization where I It was an addictions organization. So I was there for about 10 years. And when I started working, I thought, you know what, I probably need to like clean up my own house a bit. So I come from a home with a lot of mental illness and addictions and substance use. So I'm like, I'm going to get some service for myself and talk about, I've never had an addiction, but I need to talk to somebody about how this has affected me. So a couple of those ACEs, right? I've got those in my history. So this organization was a large organization and they had a whole department that was just to service folks who had been impacted by somebody else's substance use. So I started seeing a counselor there and I was feeling good about that. So I've been seeing this counselor for a couple months. And then my boss in my department came to me and said, I've been made aware that you are accessing services and that needs to end. And I was like, oh, and she said, yeah, if you're staff, you can't access service for the organization. So maybe I was like 24, 25 at the time. So I was like, oh my gosh, I did something wrong. I remember getting so hot in the face. I was so embarrassed. My boss knows that I have this stuff in my history. I'm so ashamed. And my boss did not say squat about like, here's our EAP plan, or good for you for being on your healing journey, or, you're making some proactive steps to, be a healthier person, get your house in order. None of that. She said, you need to stop. So I would argue now in hindsight, not especially trauma informed. Would we agree? I'm happy to report though that the supervisor of that other program went right up to the top and got the policy changed. I got an email like 8 months later saying, welcome back. Yeah, so being aware that we do need to have some supports for staff. And maybe that's a bit pie in the sky, but we can ask for the stars, right? And hope that we need support too. We can also look at policies and evaluate that through the lens of a trauma-informed care. So like the example I just gave you. We also want to include staff voices. What does everybody see as changes we can make in our organization to be more trauma informed? And wherever possible, including the voices of the folks that we're serving, also a great idea, right? To include and empower and embolden all of the voices that are being impacted by our services. We can also incorporate, conversations about trauma and the impacts in meetings. Again, it could be an agenda item. And one organization I worked for through some of my own advocacy, we always brought something to the table, a story about how I was being trauma informed that week. So we'd be like, does anybody have an example of how we brought this to life and how we made these principles come to life? So it would just be through story. So again, this is all related to the principle of promoting awareness. Also finding those champions of the principles. So if you've got somebody who's excited about it, then be like, all right, you're our person. So finding either, a committee of people to get excited and to roll out some initiatives or to get the ball rolling on trauma-informed care, and incorporating that into the services we provide, or just one person. I worked for the same organization I was just talking about, and I somehow got myself on the health and safety committee. So like every couple months we'd go around and look at like extension cords and the ergonomics of people's workplaces and whatever. And to be frank, it's very important work, but I was like not super interested in it. I was like, how did I get here? But I brought to the agenda psychological health and safety and wellness. So that got added to that particular committee's role, and we started initiatives. So I was excited about it. I got the ball rolling. I know that, again, we're all working in places where we're being asked to do a lot with a little. Whoops. So I know it's not easy peasy, but if you're one of those people that's excited about it, then, off you go. All right, so this next slide is a segue into our next principle. So the next trauma-informed principle is about shifting attitudes. So this slide is supposed to remind me to talk about judgment. We like judgment as humans, don't we? I love it. Like talk to my husband, like, did you hear what my sister said the other day? Oh my Lanta. I think as humans, we like judgment. It tickles something in our brain. It's probably a defense mechanism or survival response to some degree. We need to be able to organize information quickly to make decisions. It's part of our implicit brain or implicit memory. But it does get in the way of empathic curiosity and connection and genuine, authentic support and relationship, doesn't it? So in terms of the people that we're working to support, if we've got that judgmental script going in our head, it's like building a wall brick by brick between me and the person I'm trying to serve. So this next principle really is about trying to, suspend that. So I'm not going to say don't have judgment, because how can we do that? We're human. But just recognizing when that judgment pops into our head, and even recognizing what are my biases? Where do those judgments come from? Is it maybe something that comes from my own values? What's that about? And we do live in a Western world with a lot of dominant narratives, to some like therapy speak for a moment, around you know, um, asking for help is weakness, or you got to be independent, pull up your own socks, you're responsible. Everybody's, very individualistic, are some of those big messages and values that we have, here in Canada. Again, I'm painting with broad strokes here. And some of that can get in the way of our connection with the people we want to support. If I see somebody like, oh, they're late for their appointment again, they just can't get their shit together, versus like, what is going on for them? So that's what this principle is about. It's about embodying that spirit of, so shifting the dialogue in our head from, instead of being like, what's wrong with you, to maybe what has happened to you, right? What's going on for you? It makes for a more peaceful existence. Like I said, at the checkout counter, when you've got the checkout person mean mugging you or whatever. I try to remember this in traffic. Anybody else have some road rage, or is it just me? Driving behind somebody, I'm like, get going, I'm late for my appointment. So I'm like, okay, maybe they've got a cake on the back seat. I don't know what's going on for them, so I will try to take a breath. So, of course, we're all really good at this, I'm sure, in our helping roles. We are genuinely trying to put ourselves in the shoes of another, to imagine what their circumstances might be. So empathy, of course, is different than sympathy. Some of you may be familiar with Brené Brown's work. She's got some great little videos about that. So there's this one little video where, sympathy, or so say I'm in a difficult situation, imagine a big dark hole, I'm at the bottom of the hole and I'm going, holy crap, this is really tough. Sympathy is somebody looking and peeking their head into the hole and going like, that looks troublesome, sorry about your luck. Where empathy is where somebody goes, oh, and they crawl into the hole with me and they hold my hand and they go, I'm here with you. I don't have a perfect set of words. There's never been a perfect set of words to solve what's going on for you. I don't have the answers, but I'm willing to sit in this and tolerate the discomfort with you. I am here. That's what I like to imagine when I think about empathy. So if you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. So I'm going to quickly get us to do a little exercise, recognizing we have 50 minutes left, but I'm going to get it all in. So I'd invite folks to close your eyes if you're comfortable doing so. And I would like you to imagine the color blue. So you close your eyes, imagine blue. Imagine the sky, the ocean, blueberries, whales, blue jeans, blue eyes, robin's eggs, maybe even the flame, like on a hot fire or gas flame. Imagine blue, 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 blue. All right. Now I'm going to get you to open your eyes and look around the room. Anybody notice anything? So perhaps if my activity worked, the blue in the room is popping out to you now. You're seeing blue around. So we color everything with our own individual perspective, of course, our values, our biases, and these internal perspectives, they create mental models that mold our interactions with individuals and even with the world and in broader society. So this idea of shifting our attitude is just shifting that mental model in our mind so that we're seeing people in a more compassionate way and understanding that some of that really challenging, sometimes annoying, infuriating, frustrating behavior that we see from the people we're trying to support sometimes, and also our colleagues and our families, that's a response to their trauma, right? That is a trauma response. And maybe they're not that far in their healing journey yet. And this is where my role comes in. I'm helping them on their healing journey, whether it's ensuring that they have better nutrition, connecting them with supports. So people are seeing blue, I'm seeing in the chat. And the more we practice empathic curiosity, it's contagious, just like a regulated nervous system. If I see that my colleague is doing it, I'm more likely to do it. So everybody here is leaders in what they do. You're impactful and influential in the lives of the people around you. So if we practice it, it's going to be contagious. But easier said than done, especially in the face of somebody who's very dysregulated. And then we could even talk about our own safety, but that's a workshop for another day. So the third principle, fostering safety, often a good place to start when we're thinking about implementing trauma-informed practices. Excuse me. So this is both physical and psychological safety. Trauma its core is about having our safety violated. It's a boundary violation. Something happened to us, and it's also that we didn't want to happen. And it's also about having choice taken away, right? We would not have chosen our trauma, likely. So this principle is about recognizing that and creating safety around every turn. So this is looking at our work environment and imagining where can we improve here. An important component is also, do I have a slide coming up for this? Yes, I do. So consulting widely again. So talking to our colleagues, even talking to clients and asking, where are we coming up short when it comes to safety? I think it was Bill and Melinda. Is that his partner's name? All of a sudden, I'm having a brain fart. Bill and Melinda Gates. They did a survey of their workforce, and it showed that the number one indicator of feeling safe at work was being able to bring up something or ask for help without fear of judgment. That is where safety came from. So, do we in our work environments feel like we can ask for help without judgment? If the answer is yes, then that is a psychologically safe atmosphere in that regard. If the answer is no, then there's some work to be done, right? I try to role model that for my students and my kiddos all the time. I make mistakes. I need help. I don't have all the answers. My dad used to always say to me, we don't always have the answers. And the answer, when you don't have the answer, is to find somebody who has the answer. So I've tried to live that way. I haven't always, though. For a long time, I didn't. I was really living those dominant narratives around if I ask for help, it means that I'm weak. When I had twins, it was a hard lesson in asking for help. By the way, I'm still waiting for my trophy in the mail. It has not arrived. They just about killed me. But anyways, people would be like, oh, let me know if you need help. And so I would be like, yeah, okay. But what I eventually ended up doing is be like, oh, what are you doing on Tuesday from 9 to midnight? You available? Come help me because I'm losing my mind, right? So trust means that people can discuss safety concerns that really matter to them without fear of judgment. Another way to create safety is to have leaders, spaces, and peers that are safe, that we trust, that we have a good relationship with, and to identify those. And also, even for clients, to have peer support groups and this kind of thing, really important. So the fourth principle is providing choice. So looking at ways that we can create opportunities for agency and control amongst our client population. It can be very basic stuff. It could even be, what chairs people sit in, if they have access to different snacks, do they have different doors they can come in? If they're sitting in my office, can they sit here or sit there? That kind of thing. But it might also be in terms of like an intake process, like how comfortable is that process? Do clients have a choice? Do they get to talk to somebody in person? Do they have to fill out a form? Do they have the option of either? One way to see how much choice our organization has is to create a client map of a person's journey. So this is actually a tool that was taken from the business world. I think it's called customer mapping. But this is where, and we're not going to do it today, but I'm going to suggest it to you all in case this is a tool you would like to take back to your organization. So what we would do is consider a client's journey. We could even consider a staff person as well. It can be anybody. But we're going to apply a lens, whatever lens of our choosing, and we're going to look at how they traverse our services from start to finish in just like painful detail, right? How does the intake process start? Is there a referral? How does that referral happen? Do they talk to somebody in person? Do they fill out a form? How trauma informed is the form? Do they sit in a waiting room? Are there stairs? Is there a more accessible entry? I mean, like every part of the interaction. How do they get assigned a helper? Is it a counselor? Do they see the nutritionist? Are they connected? So we're going to think about all those pieces of their journey. We're going to write them down and we can draw it out. I've seen people do it on enormous papers. There's also programs you can do, like online programs and whatever. Anyways, write it all out in like excruciating detail. And then you step back and go, okay, where can we insert more choice? That's the first thing. And then we look at the pain points. And it's also great to get a client's perspective on that if we can. And where are the parts, of all these little pieces and all these interactions that the client has with our services? where can we implement more of these trauma-informed principles, right? Um, this is such a cool tool. I've done it with organizations all over the place throughout the country, and it can really be like, wow, right? Because the work that we're doing, again, we're doing lots with little in many cases. We are often under-resourced in the public systems, right? And we keep moving, right? Like there's always something to do. There's always another fire. There's always a waiting list. There's always a referral that needs my attention. And so what this map does, in my opinion, the research would also suggest that it's that whole working smarter, not harder business. So it makes everything more streamlined, to create a more trauma-informed experience for the client. And that just allows for a more smooth process. Then we see less of those challenging behaviors emerge, right? Because there's less friction. So I would suggest this as a tool, mapping a client's journey. And for more information on that, just Google it, mapping a client's journey or mapping a person's journey. We can also do this for staff, right? What does it look like when a new staff enters our organization? You know, do they feel welcome? Do they feel supported? Thanks, Nicole. Twins, yes. Can you send me I'm looking at the chat. Can you send me my trophy? I keep joking about this with my partner, but also like not joking. Trophy, please. Every line on my face is a result of those kiddos. This is what, so I am talking to you with the organization I'm working for, which is called CTRI. This is CTRI's example of mapping. So this is very detailed. Yours doesn't necessarily need to look like this, but they use this tool for orientating new staff to their organization. So they go, this is what it looks like when a client comes in and uses our services. These are all the different ways that we want to promote a smoother experience for them. This is where there's often pain points, and this is what we're doing about it. So that's another way to promote awareness around trauma as well, is when we're orientating new staff to say, hey, we are a trauma-informed environment. This is how we're a trauma-informed environment. This is how we're working towards it. Right. I'm talking fast, forgive me. I'm trying to consciously slow down, but I get excited. So this is the fifth principle, highlighting strengths. This is it's the, the forgotten middle child of the principles of trauma-informed care. So many people who've experienced trauma have survived and found new ways to live and overcome obstacles because of their inherent strengths. We all have inherent strengths, and sometimes they kind of get lost in the hustle and bustle. So whether we're thinking about the people we work with or our colleagues or the clients we're supporting, just actually stopping and very purposely and intentionally shining a big old flashlight on the strengths. Sometimes when I would, working with clients, I spent most of my therapy days working with youth. And I might be like, hey, kiddo, what do you like about yourself? What are the things you're proud of? What are things that, you'd want me to know? And sometimes I'd get like, well, nothing. There's nothing. I'm not good at anything. Everything is garbage. Like, okay, I can understand how you might feel that way. And then I would say, well, you've talked to me a lot about your kukum. You've been talking about her like crazy. I'd like for you to tell me about how your kukum would describe you. And you're like, oh, well, they would say that like I come visit every day after school, and that I'm really good at taking out the garbage and, whatever. So even getting somebody to step outside themselves, to try to see themselves from a different perspective can be a way to get people to reflect on their own strengths. And then once we see those strengths and we hear them, we can bolster them and lift them up. A way to, sort of amplify the impacts of highlighting strengths can be giving positive feedback in sort of a public forum. So being like, hey, Wendy, thank you so much for picking up that client for me last week that I'd overbooked myself, or, whatever the case. Thank you so much for doing that. We're announcing it in the lunchroom. Ah, that feels good. I'm feeling recognized and seen for the work that I'm doing. There's something else I was going to say about that, and I can't remember what it was. Oh, Leah, thank you. She gave me a trophy in the chat. I love it. That's the first one I've received. Oh. So whether it's for our clients or our colleagues, looking for ways to be like, hey, this is awesome. And I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, but of course they need to be genuine compliments. I can't say to my client, I know that you're an awesome mother. Do I know that? Have I seen that? Have I seen that they're an awesome mother? I might even have some evidence to the contrary, right? But to say, I can tell that you really love your kiddos, right? Ensuring that it's a genuine strength that I'm highlighting. Because folks who've gone through trauma are often like good BS detectors. Would you guys agree? And if I'm being inauthentic and not genuine, that is going to come across. So just being mindful about the types of strengths that we're highlighting. I'm going to leave us with just a note about self-care. I when I say self-care, it almost feels like a bad word coming out of my mouth because again, recognizing that there's only so much control we have. But when I'm doing client work, sometimes I'll get people to do logs. Maybe some of you do this. I'll be like, hey, depending on the client, be like, you know what, between now and the next time I see you, I just want you to take some notes about what your day looks like. You know, got up, ate some toast, talked to, my friend on the phone, shot a text to my neighbor, went to bed at 9, got up at 6, whatever. Just the basics of what your day looks like. And then they'll bring that information to me, and there's often something that stands out. And I think it's something that we're all guilty of, which is we are torturing ourselves and treating ourselves like prisoners of war, right? We're malnourished, we're dehydrated, we're sleep deprived, we're socially isolated, we're getting way too much screen time, we're not outside enough, all of that stuff. The basics of wellness is the stuff that I preach, and we are all preaching to the people we support. We gotta look after ourselves. It's really the step one. And this is me giving you permission. And I got to tell you, sometimes I walk the talk, but often I don't. Often I don't. But again, it's that piece around role modeling, right? Role modeling what health looks like, role modeling our humanness, that how effective can I be if I'm not filling up my own cup? For those of you that are on social media, maybe you guys have seen this little meme going around. There's lots of variations of it where like this person is talking to a friend. Sometimes it's animals talking to each other. The last one I saw were ducks. So the one duck says to the other duck, I feel like garbage. I have no motivation to do anything. There's so much to do. The world is a flaming dumpster fire. Then the other duck goes, oh, tell me, have you had any sleep? How much sleep did you have? Oh, 4 hours. Have you had any water to drink? No. When's the last time you ate? I don't know. Have you ever connected, have you done something that brings you joy? No. Have you, eaten a nutritious meal? Whatever. And then the duck's like, no, 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 no. And they're like, I wonder why you feel, that crummy. We just got to look after the basics. And one of the basics is surrounding ourselves with people that fill up our cup, right? So finding those meaningful connections and spending time with the people that we love most. Finding those people that regulate us and spending more time with them, and trying to maybe spend a little less time with the people that dysregulate us if that's an option. I live in an intergenerational home. My in-laws live with us. I've got 3 kids, a partner, a variety of animals. And my father-in-law is in late stage dementia. My father also passed away of dementia. And some of his behaviors right now are very dysregulated. So one of the things that one of his quirks right now is he's got a thing about food. So I'll be cooking supper and he comes to the stove and looks and he goes, ugh, that looks disgusting. And I'm just like, oh man, so dysregulating. I know that it's not him. It's his ailment, of course. But because I have that energy around me right now, I am having to be a little bit more deliberate about filling up my cup. And for me, that means really connecting in a meaningful way with the people that I love and I care about. All right, that brings us to the hour. I'm just going to peek at the chat here. It looks like there's nothing that I've missed. Time is our most finite resource, is it not? And we spent it here together, and I genuinely appreciate that. Thank you so much for your time, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your learning.
Jocelyne, this has been a wonderful way to spend time. Thank you so much. There was one question near the beginning that I sort of missed, and then it didn't feel opportune. You had mentioned a workshop that you offer at the beginning, and Emma had asked in the chat, where do you offer this workshop? And I was a little bit distracted navigating emails at that point. So do you recall what you're referring to?
Yeah, so I work for Brandon University, but I also do this contract work with CTRI. So if you just look up CTRI, when I go to say what the letters stand for, I'm always scared I'm going to say it wrong. I never have. The Crisis and Trauma Resource Institute, CTRI. So they offer a whole vast of workshops workshops, webinars, everything they offer is virtual or in person. They've got lots of different trainers with a variety of backgrounds and expertise. So I teach a whole lot of stuff that they offer. You can always request a trainer if you want to hear me, ramble on about crazy things. You could say you liked me and I can do your training for you. But they've got a whole whackload of trainings out there. So like trauma-informed care, again, it can be a full day workshop. I do trauma-informed schools, motivational interviewing, CBT, DBT. I mean, like the list goes on and on and on. Yeah, so check that out.
That is excellent. We'll certainly be sharing your contact information with our conference follow-up. Well, I'm going to quickly go into our coffee card giveaway. I've got a few questions from the session. I am seeing mostly, Jocelyne, just lots of gratitude and props in the chat for you there. So the first question I have from the session, sorry, I get myself organized here. Okay, so in looking to embrace trauma-informed care, Jocelyne talked about that a good place to start is to foster, and I'm going to put this in the chat as well, a good place to start is to foster blank. Oh, and I'm seeing, yes, Rebecca. Rebecca, did you win a coffee card already?
This is my first session I'm able to attend. We had some in-person
Right.
programming
Oh,
yesterday.
Rebecca, I'm not going to argue. Yes, Rebecca. Awesome. Okay, wonderful. Congratulations. Excellent. So fostering safety. The second one is Jocelyne talked about trauma being a blank wound. Trauma is often a blank wound. Oh, I'm seeing some good answers. The first one, though, is Lisa Whalen, says invisible. That was the answer I was going for. But the other answers were also excellent. Hidden, yeah, lots of good responses there. So congratulations, Lisa. And one more question. This was from a sorry, just getting myself organized here. So this is from, I believe, Dan Siegel work, where you talked about the window of tolerance is when we have blank emotions. The window of tolerance is when we have blank emotions. And there's an M word I'm looking for here, manageable. Sandra. Sandra, could you share your last name in the chat so that I can track you down? Sandra, congratulations. Or email me, Sandra, with your full name, and then we can follow up on that. Wonderful. I did put the link to the session evaluation in the chat, and definitely invite everybody to do an entry into the grand prize. Congratulations to Rebecca, Lisa, and Sandra. Oh, thank you for Sandra's last name there. I'll just make a note of that. It's easy for me to lose track after the event. Okay, Jocelyne, so much gratitude for your wisdom, your experience, your sharing, and your energy and your passion. I really enjoyed and learned a lot from this session, and we're so glad that you were able to come and be a part of our event. Thank you so much. And
thanks for the opportunity. Take good care.
Take good care, and thanks everybody for joining. I'll stop recording now, and